Thank you everyone for joining the 6th year commemoration of the Yazidi genocide. Murad, good to see you again. Nawaf, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Perry. I want to thank Free Yazidi Foundation for putting together this important conference in this significant but very, very sad day for all of us. Thank you to our international audience and our Yazidi audience for joining us here today. And thank you for our panelists today. 6 years ago, on this day, 3rd of August 2014, and at this exact time I remember, I took a break from one of my class that I was taking at the American University of Iraq, Suleimania, to check the 40 missed calls and hundreds of text messages that I had from my family, friends, and relatives in Sinjar on this day at this hour. The first text message I remember very well, I read, was from a friend of mine who said, "Everything is gone, and they took my 5 sisters." I immediately called her back, asking what was happening, and where were the security forces. She said, "Everyone left us behind with 2 choices, either death or run for their life." That friend of mine was one of more than 350,000 Yazidis who were left with these 2 choices. Sinjar, what we falsely believed was protected, safe, and secure, fell into the hands of few hundreds fighters, Daesh fighters, in a matter of hours. In Sinjar, its people were left alone facing an ultimate genocide. The Iraqi army collapsed and had run away days before that. The so-called police border protection followed them a few days later. And then on the day of genocide, so did the Kurdish forces. As a result of that, more than 2,000 people were killed. About 7,000 women, children were abducted by ISIS, and the rest had to run for their lives towards Sinjar Mountain, Syria or Kurdistan. And more than 80% of Sinjar was destroyed, including dozens of Yazidi shrines, schools, and hospitals. After 6 years, and as we speak of today, most of what has been or was destroyed has not yet been rebuilt, despite of all the attention and the effort. There are still about 3,000 Yazidi women, children, girls are missing as we speak of today. More than 70 mass graves have been discovered. Villages, homelands are still full. Villages, houses are still full of ISIS planted landmines. In Sinjar, there is no water, no electricity, no education, no even basic services. And that is from my experience as a Yazidi from Sinjar, I'm talking. And the most important point of all this, there is no security, and there is no even sense of security to any Yazidi citizen in Sinjar. After all, it is the security, it is the safety that would allow our people to go back to their home, but unfortunately, it is lacking today. In terms of security, as we're going to be talking about the security of Sinjar and the threats, future threats, Sinjar today is divided among and controlled by different forces and militias. We will get into details more about this. Those who are from Sinjar, like me and Murad, who's on this panel, and those who are concerned with the future of Yazidi, like the rest of my panelists, understand how essential security and prevention is for any realistic prospects for the future of the Yazidi and the region. Today, I'm delighted to have with me on this panel a group of great, knowledgeable experts to discuss these issues of security. I have today with me Ms. Nadine Maenza, a commissioner of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom in Washington, D.C. I'm so pleased to have you on this panel, Ms. Nadine. I also have Dr. Amy Austin Holmes, a fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Dr. Amy, for being here with us today. I also have Evelina Ochab, a co-founder of the Coalition for Genocide Response and the author of a great book, Never Again. Thank you so much for being able to joining us, Evelina. Last but not the least, Murad Ismail, a dear friend, a Yazidi true activist, one of my favorite Yazidi activists, and somebody who I personally look into, the co-founder and the former director of Yazda, Murad Ismail, who's now based in Texas. I will ask you all to welcome this great group of panelists and to talk about this very important issue of security of Yazidi in general and Sinjar in specific. I will ask all my panelists these first questions, and if you can add some other remarks that you may have prepared, and then we will get into more specific questions for each one of them. For our audience, also, I would say, if you have a question, please drop into the Q&A box so our panelists can answer them. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. So for all my panelists, I will ask this question: what do you believe are the greatest threat facing the Yazidi people right now? Who do you think are contributing to these threats? Should we be paying attention to possible threats to prevent future attacks on Yazidi? How can we do that? Why don't we start with you, Ms. Nadine Maenza?
Thank you. And I would like to thank Pari and the Free Yazidi Foundation for their important work and for giving me the honor of participating in this panel today with some of my favorite voices on these issues. I'm pleased to be talking about this issue of security, which we need to acknowledge is at the heart of the Yazidi community's past tragedies and as well as its most urgent and pressing need. This lack of security is clearly evident in the real and ongoing threats that the Yazidis and the other religious ethnic minorities continue to face in Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, Iran-backed fighters and Ashashabi, or Popular Mobilization Forces, continue to represent a corrosive presence and cruel barrier to the free movement and safe return of Yazidis to Sinjar, and other minorities to the Nineveh Plains as well. The U.S. should pressure the Iraqi government to implement its own stated policy to rein in these militias. And it was only 2 months ago that the Turkish airstrikes hit so uncomfortably close to returning families in Sinjar into IDP camps in northern Iraq. In neighboring Syria, successive Turkish invasions have displaced tens of thousands of Yazidis and other religious and ethnic minorities from the area of Afrin in 2018, and a wider strip of territory in northeast Syria in late 2019. In May, Nadia Murad spoke out against this violence, and she tweeted, "Turkish-backed militias are silently carrying out a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Yazidis in Afrin and Syria. They are kidnapping women, killing civilians, and destroying houses and shrines. To date, the international community has failed to bring attention to these crimes." In addition, Genocide Watch has called these atrocities war crimes and crimes against humanity. In other words, Turkey's operations in northern Syria have again threatened to facilitate the religious and ethnic cleansing of Yazidis and other vulnerable minorities, communities who already suffered so much under ISIS only a few short years ago. In both Iraq and Syrian contexts, the US government cannot rest with just providing humanitarian aid to Yazidis and other religious and ethnic minorities, as essential as the assistance must be. It must also act decisively to push back against the regional forces that threaten the safety and security of those very communities. From Turkey's invasion into northeast Syria and alliance with radical Islamist militias there, to Iran's stranglehold on Iraq's security through its PMF allies. The only greater threat than security is indifference. After all the attention, all the speeches, the money spent on by governments, the genocide resolutions, how can so little have changed on the ground in Sinjar for the Yazidi community? How can the international community look away right now at the violence happening against Yazidis in Turkey, in the area that is being occupied by Syria? I hope that the remembrance of this anniversary will help jumpstart some resolve to change the security situation for the Yazidis in both Iraq and Syria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. And I will go ask Murad Smail, a Yazidi activist who been advocating for a better security, a better future for Yazidi for last 6 years. The same question to you, Murad.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm really proud of the work that Free Yazidi Foundation is doing and for holding this conference. Really great job, and I commend your work here. The security to me is really the #1 issue for the Yazidi community. And I think it will be the determinant of the recovery of the Yazidi community from the genocide, and it is continuity as a culture, as a community in Iraq, in Syria, and beyond. The security is the #1 thing we should worry about after the genocide, that the Yazidi community should be safe today, tomorrow, for the next 100 years. And that's something that does not come easily when you are a minority, that you don't make your own rules, you don't make your own military, you don't hold control on your own police. You are a subject to a regional complexity and a national complexity in the region that also resulted the genocide of 2014. So going back to 2014, why Yazidis suffered a genocide in the first place? Yazidis did not suffer a genocide since 1920, since the Iraqi state was established. This is the first genocide was committed against the Yazidi community since the modern states as we see them are established. So it happened when the state failed, when a militia took over, or a terrorist group in this case, took over large parts of Iraq and Syria. And for that security, when that security fell, so the way I think about it, I think about the same security that we need to prevent something that could happen as in 2014. It's very possible that ISIS will reemerge, given that the situation in Iraq, if it doesn't improve significantly on the reconciliation between all Iraqi components into an inclusive government and also into economic prosperity. It's very possible that another group, ISIS or similar group, will find roots again if we don't deal with the issues that resulted in ISIS coming into existence. Also, security of what called disputed areas in 2014, that really was also a reason that the genocide took place, and then there was no defense. There was no defense in 2014, and that's why people were defenseless in face of ISIS. So when we talk about security, we need to create a situation in Sinjar, in Ninawa Plain, for minorities and for the greater region where the religious minorities are there, but also the ethnic minorities like Shabak and others in the Ninawa Plains and in Sinjar. We need to think about sustainable security that will protect these areas and will not be subject to political changes and complexities of Iraq. Well, of course, I would hope that Iraq as a country will be protected, that as a nation will be protected, that again, a group will not find a way to come and invade the country. So we need to, when you think about the security for Yazidis, you also think about security for the country. You also think about the security for the region, where the Middle East, are we going to allow another group like this to happen in Syria? For example, what happened in Syria? As Nadine said, the Yazidi community in Syria now is going under a genocide. This time it's not an ISIS. And that genocide will not be also Yazidis too. It will go to other communities. So what is lacking is a regional plan and an international plan that goes all the way to honestly the failure of the Security Council to address the issues in Iraq and Syria, and also comes down to how you are going to deal with the situation in Syria, how you are going to deal with the situation in Iraq. The disputed areas will not be protected without having its own mechanism for protection. And I have been pushing for a local force of no less than 50,000 in federal police, in border police, in the army, and in the forces that basically the people of the region can believe in it. And that forces has to be supported by the Iraqi government, by the international community. We need to come into some agreement between Baghdad and Erbil. The two areas, or the two regional government and central government, claim control on these areas. We need to discuss that as well in participation with the minorities in this region. The security needs to be sustainable. We not only local police, we need heavy armed forces from the people of this region, because I am just as certain as I'm talking to you now, that there will be threats coming, and that our communities would have to be resilient, and they would have to be the one who is carrying the weapon when the next ISIS comes. If the international community, I don't see possibility of international protection at this point because of the complexities, the geopolitical complexities that go all the way up, as I said, to the Security Council, where Russia, China, the US, other countries are all in this struggle, political and security struggle that is global. So I don't see an international protection happening in that meaning. But international protection could be through creating and supporting logistically, training-wise, of the local forces. Also, when you talk about security, so now we have to also talk about the militias that are in Sinjar and in other areas. You really cannot have a country when you have groups that don't act by the constitution, and groups are foreign to your land. So we need, that problem is in Sinjar, in Nineveh Plain, in the rest of Iraq too. We have a really great issue on the sovereignty of Iraq as a state. You need to build an army that only abides by law, that comes from the constitution, from the prime minister of Iraq. We need to, of course, the militias or the groups, armed groups that are created in Sinjar were created for a reason. So they are locals. If you talk about Yabasha, if you talk about Yazidi Peshmergas, if you could talk about the Yazidi Protection Force, if you talk about the Yazidi PMU, Khal Ali and others who were created, these are all great people. So these are all our people who came and who rose against ISIS. Now for someone to come and label them as something else, that's something we're not happy with it. But honestly, we are also not happy about a state of lawlessness, where groups are acting as they are not part of the law. So there is no perfection here. We need to get the international community, and in the first place, actually, not the international community. This is an Iraqi issue, Iraqi territory. And then there is the Kurdistan regional government, which is a partner in this, and it's also part of Iraq. So Kurdistan region is part of Iraq. It's not a separate country. We also talk about the local government of Nineveh, which is also a local government in the new constitution. It's as a province, is also as a region. We need to think about this. We need to sit down. We need to resolve the issues. We need to not give excuses to Turkey or other countries to come in. That's not something we like. We don't like to see Turkey to come in. But at the same time, that means we have to address some issues so Turkey doesn't have concerns. Yazidi should not be going against Turkey. Yazidi should not be militarily. Legally you can go against anyone who you think is bad, who've issued, created problems for you. But we need to think as a minority. We need to act as a minority. We need also to work with other religious minorities in the Nineveh Plain and in the region, so we can think about and develop a security mechanism that will protect the region, will get away the Turkish threat, will get away all other threats, other countries, regional countries who are trying to build land bridges to other areas. I mean, this is not our really, we just came out of a genocide. We need to look forward to rebuild our people, rebuild our homeland, rebuild our own situation, so the Yazidis have the enough resilience so this doesn't happen again. And sorry, I've just took a little bit long time. So that was my remarks.
Thank you so much, Murad. Very well said. As you mentioned about Syria, I remember many times my grandfather saying, as long as Syria is safe, Sinjar is safe, or Yazidi are safe. I want right now to turn to Dr. Amy Austin, almost, and I know she's been writing a lot about Syria and the Yazidis in Syria. Whether in Syria or Iraq, Dr. Amy, what do you believe the greatest threats that are facing the Yazidi people in this both area, and is there a connection there?
All right, well, thank you to the Free Yazidi Foundation for organizing this important event today, and for bringing together all the various panels that you have, and also thank you for the invitation for me to speak. I think there are four main threats, if I can just summarize it very quickly, that the Yazidis are facing. Two of them, Nadine and Murad have already spoken about, so I won't go into detail about that to save time, but they have already mentioned, first of all, the fact that there is a lack of clarity and responsibility, frankly, for who is responsible for protecting the Sinjar region of Iraq. And that the lack of clarity is actually a huge security threat to the Yazidis in Iraq. And so until the disputed nature of that territory is resolved, I am afraid that that threat will remain. And so addressing the disputed territory of Sinjar is absolutely crucial, first of all. Second, Nadine mentioned the indifference, frankly, of the global community. That is a huge threat that the Yazidis are facing. It is, for me, hard to understand how 82 countries in the world came together as part of the global coalition. 1/3 of all the countries in the world came together in the fight against the Islamic State. And now those victims of the Islamic State, almost 3,000 Yazidis who are still missing, that there's very, very little resources devoted to finding them. I find this extremely hard to understand. And it's frankly unacceptable that you have such a huge, coalition of the most powerful countries in the world that are part of the global coalition, and yet the resources that are needed to find those missing Yazidis are simply not being made available, and the efforts are not being coordinated. I think in order to find the missing Yazidis, that will require increased coordination between all of the relevant authorities, including the authorities in Baghdad, in Erbil, and also the autonomous administration in northeast Syria, as well as in Turkey and the other members of the coalition. A third problem is that the self-administration of northeast Syria does not have adequate resources themselves to engage in the necessary investigations to find the missing people. And so they need support in order to coordinate their efforts to continue to build a database that is, of these missing Yazidis in order to find them. However, the biggest threat, in my opinion, for Yazidis, particularly in Syria, is coming from the Turkish-backed Islamist militias that have occupied Afrin and now Ras Al Ain Serikane. Afrin, in the northwestern part of Syria, unfortunately, the Syrian Yazidis have been almost, virtually ignored by the international community, which is also another tragedy. Afrin has been home to Yazidis since the 12th century. They're an ancient indigenous minority of Afrin, and they're now it's difficult to have exact estimates as to their exact population size, in part because under the Ba'athist regime, Yazidis were not allowed to identify as Yazidis, and so they had to register as Muslims. And so often it's Yazidis will be registered as Muslims and not as Yazidis. But an estimated 90% of the Yazidi population of Afrin have fled since the Turkish intervention and occupation that started in January 2018. That means that all of the Yazidi villages in Afrin are under control of the Turkish military and their Islamist militias. All of the Yazidi shrines, the holy sacred shrines in Afrin, are under the control of Turkey and their Islamist militias. More than half of those shrines have been defaced or destroyed. And finally, another extremely worrying fact is that there have been many cases of kidnappings of Yazidis. since Afrin has come under occupation by Turkey. Just in this year, in February, a woman by the name of Laura Hassan, a 19-year-old Yazidi woman, was kidnapped from Karabash, a Yazidi village. She was tortured while she was in custody and forced or pressured to renounce her religion. In February 27, a woman by the name of Arinda Lil Hassan was kidnapped from the Kemar village. She was found then in the Hamza prison run by the Hamza Brigade. In March, a 20-year-old woman, Ghazala Batal, was kidnapped. And then a few days after that, her mother was kidnapped. So there are families who've had multiple members of their own family kidnapped within days of each other. And so to me, this is, a sign that this is an enduring and systemic problem. They're not just a few isolated incidents. The armed groups that are active in some of these areas include Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, Falak al-Sham, the Hamza Division, Mu'tasam Brigade, the Waqas Brigade, Liwa Samarkand, Falak al-Majid, Rajal al-Harb, Sultan Murad, etc. And so these militias that are controlling Afrin are part of the so-called Syrian National Army, which are, of course, trained by Turkey. And so what is needed is for there to be, first of all, access to Afrin for international human rights organizations to try to locate and find some of these Yazidis who've been kidnapped. Some of them have been released, but some of them are still missing. And so this is, to me, one of the major threats that is ongoing now in Syria that the Yazidi community are facing.
Thank you so much. Very well said. Thank you for your insight. Yes, whether in Syria or Iraq, Yazidis area are controlled by different militias. There is a difference not just in the regional powers of helping Yazidi, but also in the global coalition. I will turn the mic to Evelina to talk about probably what should we be paying attention to these possible threats that our other panelists talk about to prevent future attacks on Yazidis.
Sure, thank you very much. I would like to join all panelists in thanking the Free Yazidi Foundation for organizing this event. And just very briefly, I wanted to mention that, at least in my opinion, one of the greatest threats continues to be Daesh and any similar terror organizations that will emerge. And I think we do need to change our perception of the threat posed by Daesh. Daesh is not gone. And also, apart from the remaining Daesh remnants in the region, the ideology persists. And also, as we can see right now, Daesh is using COVID-19 pandemic to grow in strength once again. COVID-19 pandemic creates perfect conditions for Daesh to grow, and we cannot ignore this fact. And I just wanted to very briefly mention a recent UN report that talks about the threat posed by Daesh during this pandemic. And the report says that Daesh has been using this pandemic to advance propaganda and fundraising, and in some regions are seeking to take advantage of perceptions that the attention of security forces is diverted elsewhere. It has exploited security gaps caused by the pandemic and by political turbulence in Iraq to relaunch a sustained rural insurgency, as well as sporadic operations in Baghdad and other large crises. And the UN report also says that should the pandemic lead to a severe global recession, the international community may be facing further headwinds in countering terrorism and extremist narratives. So to emphasize, this Daesh threat is not gone. COVID-19 poses new challenges in addressing the threats, and it gives new opportunities for terror organizations like Daesh to grow in strength. So we need to monitor, and we have to respond to early warning signs. And also, as the panelists already mentioned, security is key to help to prevent those atrocities from materializing. And also, just in terms of the early warning signs, as you asked, I think we need to think, when we think about Daesh atrocities, Daesh genocide, we need to remember that the genocide did not happen overnight. The Daesh genocide did not happen overnight. Genocide never does. Genocide is a process. It requires preparation, planning, organization. And also, as Nadine already mentioned, it requires also our ignorance of the early warning signs indicative of mass atrocities to come. And of course, states are under a duty to prevent under the UN Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, although the convention does not prescribe how this duty is to be fulfilled. However, the International Court of Justice tackled the issue and mentioned in one of its judgments in Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia and Montenegro that the duty to prevent is a conduct-oriented duty. It's not a result-oriented duty. So that the judgment says that, that a state cannot be under an obligation to succeed, whatever the circumstances, in preventing the commission of genocide. The obligation of states parties is rather to employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent genocide as far as possible. And the duty to prevent is triggered when the state learns of, or should normally have learned, of the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. And this ultimately means that the state should have effective monitoring mechanisms. Where states do not have such monitoring mechanisms, they may rely on the arguments of the lack of relevant knowledge and so avail themselves of responsibility. And this is, of course, contrary to the duty to prevent and the spirit of the Genocide Convention. And have states taken steps to prevent the Daesh genocide against religious minorities in Iraq? And of course, other panelists already mentioned the Global Coalition Against Daesh. And of course, the Global Coalition Against Daesh acted to stop Daesh atrocities from continuing, and so prevented the destruction of religious minorities in the region in whole. But this does not change the fact that significant loss of life and damage to religious minority groups took place. So we are talking about partial destruction, and there was no one to prevent this partial destruction. So indeed, in terms of preventing genocide from occurring, states and international communities, we all have failed. Could we have done more? When we talk about this genocide perpetrated by Daesh, we talk about it starting in 2014. However, again, genocide does not just happen. And I will give you a brief example of what evidence, for example, here in the UK, the government had, which should have triggered the duty to prevent. And I would very briefly mention a report from 2011. And the UK Border Agency published a report on the situation in Iraq back then. The report identified deadly attacks on religious minorities, especially during religious gatherings, harassment, intimidation, kidnappings, and murder. Armed groups attack Christians, Yazidis, Shabak communities, labeling them as crusaders, devil worshippers, infidels. And the report described growing lawlessness and impunity. So the early warning signs of genocide to come were there in 2011. However, we can also look further back to 2003. And 2003, this is the date when many religious minorities identify as the time that their situation in Iraq deteriorated significantly. And of course, after the fall of the foreign regime, many religious minority groups were singled out on the basis of their religion. And single incidents of violence turned into more organized and systemic attacks. And the size of religious minority groups started to decrease significantly after that. Slowly but surely, the situation of religious minorities in Iraq began its journey through single attacks to mass atrocities to genocide. So the signs were there back in 2003 and the following years. The very clear signs of mass atrocities to come were there in 2011. And the report that the UK had from 2011 is very clear of those early warning signs. But in both cases, we failed to act and prevent. And this brings us to right now, 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic. And as already mentioned, the UN is very clear that the Daesh is using the COVID pandemic to grow in strength. And this is where we need to act and to prevent yet another wave of mass atrocities against religious minorities in Iraq. And also, this is where we need very urgently comprehensive and sustainable solution for the question of security in Iraq. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelina. I think that's a very crucial point to pay attention. You know, the Daesh is using the pandemic to re-emerge, to grow and strengthen. At the same time, we're seeing our people in displaced camps in Iraqi Kurdistan. They are afraid of the pandemic because it's not a matter of when the pandemic will get into the campus, but it's a matter of when it will get into it. So some of them are fleeing back, you know, going back to Sinjar, fleeing the pandemic this time. So Murad, I want to ask you these questions. Uh, in your assessment of the safety for families in Sinjar, you know, many of them are now going back. What do you think should the world, the whole world, the international community or the local governments do right now to help Yazidis in Sinjar right now?
It's time. It is time after 6 years that we come into our consciousness and come into rationalism. We need to sit down. We need to sit down and we need to bring rule of law, because rule of law, that's what creates a society. You cannot have a functioning society when you don't have rule of law. In a modern state, you need to have your administration, local administration, you need to have your security in place, you need to have a security that's trusted by the people. You need to have functioning system where people can work. To me, the return is not just physical return. Honestly, the threat that I see are also economic threats. So we're coming out, we're in the pandemic, and we have people unemployment at maybe 80%, and this situation is not sustainable economically. But of course, you're not going to be able to have an economy if you don't have security. You're not going to have an economy if you don't have administration of the region. So we need to really get back that and appeal to remove these issues of disagreement. And you know, the goal has to be by everyone is that it has to be a human case. Because we can talk politics day and night. We can be radical as much as you want, as left as you want, as right you want. But eventually, the Yazidi genocide is a human case. It's a case that really touched the life of millions of people across the globe. Today and yesterday, we saw people from every walk of life. They joined the Yazidis, they cried with us, they work with us on this. And Iraq and Kurdistan region both need to also channel that and use that for creating an example of success in Sinjar and in the other minorities areas, you know, not also, you know, forgetting other minorities too. We have, you know, the Christians of Iraq, 1.5 million people who mostly left Iraq because they were not safe. We have Kakayans, you know, 7 of them were killed just, you know, less than a month ago. To me, it's not only the Yazidi issue, it's a minority issues, it is a country issue, it's a regional issue, it's an issue of we are really, you know, at a pivot point basically for what Middle East will be and what Iraq will be. And I think if we fail in Sinjar, we're failing in Iraq. And I think, you know, another Iraq will just be in this cycle of violence, you know, vicious cycle of violence. That every other group in Iraq also have suffered genocides. If you look to Iraqi history, where everybody has been suffering, because we never really established a state where people are protected, where people are safe and people are equal. So security is an integrated part of rest of aspects of life, of a functioning state. You know, people going back, I mean, this is our homeland. We cannot abandon it. We cannot leave it for others to decide what happens to it. You know, that's why, yes, we go back. We don't go back now, we go back next year. We go back to our land, we rebuild our homeland. But we try to do it in a way that is civilized, you know, a way that's a success story, and not a way where you send someone to a house that is destroyed, that probably, you know, landmines even all are not removed, that still, you know, 80 mass graves still are not removed. So, you know, we're talking about a situation that requires really a global campaign, but Iraq and Kurdistan, you know, Iraq has to be the heart of it, Kurdistan has to be the heart of it, Kurdistan region has to be the heart of it, the people, the Yazidi people have to be heart of it. You know, they have, you cannot work out a solution without that, you know. I mean, I realize a lot of people want to work with Baghdad. A lot of people only want to work with Erbil. A lot of people are wanting to work with somewhere else, you know, outside Iraq. I realized that. But you know, we need to be rational, and we need to channel all our connections. You know, we need to channel our connections for the benefit of people, and we need to also, you know, create an example of success. You know, yesterday I spoke about an example of success, and if you want, we had a genocide. You know, you want to have another side of the coin. You know, you need the human society to be proud of something. You need to be Iraq needs to be proud of something. We not always talk about tragedy, about conflict. You know, think about the region. I mean, even the peace could also include Turkey, include every country in the region. We really need to move out of this hostile situation where everybody wants to fight everybody. Everybody wants to grab everybody's land. Everybody wants to get others leaving. I mean, if Christians all leave Iraq, you know, Iraq will lose a color, a beautiful color. If Caucasians leave, Iraq will lose a beautiful color. Same for the Yazidis. But you know, it's a matter of time if we don't act collectively. You know, it's a matter of time if we don't act collectively. That I think eventually there will be no minorities in Iraq. You know, we're talking maybe about 50 years. You know, as far as maybe 100 years. But we don't want that to happen, and it's really the time to act. And I see momentum with the 6th anniversary, and we should act on it. And security, as I want to just re-emphasize that we're talking about physical security of numbers, you know, weapons, understanding and organization, and groups that will follow rule of law, that will not follow orders from any other country, that will follow the orders from Baghdad or from whoever the head of the operations are in Nineveh and in the region. Also, the long term, I believe that both Nineveh Plain and Sinjar either would have to be their own province, one province that will include Sinjar, Tal Afar, Rabia, Zammar, Nineveh Plain, that will include the areas that are, you know, culturally different, that just have different history. And maybe if we isolate that difference, maybe if we isolate that difference and that situation, then it's easier for us to handle it. We're not talking about another country. We're just talking about administrative boundaries. You know, so a way for us to enable us to lead and to recover and to bring this area in Iraq, to bring it to stability. Also, you know, if you think about it, all the issues between Iraq and Kurdistan region is because of the disputed areas. ISIS came because of the lack of security in these areas. You know, every issue you see, Iraq is lacking behind because of this area. So what you really need to isolate this area, and then you need to be able to address. So I think administration of these areas, that's also another pillar of solution, but the physical security of 50,000 locals under rule of law is the answer.
Thank you so much, Murad. As I totally agree, as we are thinking of short-term solution, we also have to think of some long-term solutions. And I think your proposal it's a great one of this long-term solution. And I also mentioned this to a lot of people because it was a disputed territories, and because, you know, terrorist groups knew that nobody will protect this area if they attack them. That's why they had them as their first target. I totally agree on that. One of the obstacles in you know, again, in front of Yazidi going back to Sinjar is the Turkish airstrike. I want to ask Nadine this question. You have been speaking about the Turkish airstrikes in Sinjar. Do you believe that United States has pressured or will pressure, if we're talking about future, Turkey to cease airstrike in Sinjar, and what is your personal opinion about that?
Yes, thank you. Well, in mid-June, I just returned from meetings actually with Murad Ismail at the White House and the State Department, where we had talked about conditions for Yazidis in Iraq and Syria and how we were encouraged that several hundred Yazidis had just returned from Sinjar when news broke about the Turkish airstrikes in Sinjar. And it's not a coincidence that these airstrikes seem to occur when there's either returnees coming back to Sinjar or it's near religious holidays. While Turkey claims that it launched these airstrikes in response to, let me get this right, quote, attacks and plans to attack our country, our people, our police station, our bases. you know, we find it hard at USERF to believe that Sinjar is a threat to the homeland of Turkey. You know, these operations in northern Iraq cannot be separated from Turkey's deeply repressive occupation of northeast Syria and the expansion of its involvement. You can see it in Libya. President Erdogan is seeking to increase his footprint and his influence around the Middle East and North Africa. These actions are also coming at a time when Erdogan's government and its leadership is increasingly tested by its terrible economy, a continued struggle to address COVID-19, and also former allies who put together a new political party against the president. So, you know, so much of this seems to be really a way to distract his population from their own problems. In terms of the US government, you know, we at USERF have been, as you know, very strong on this, and we're bipartisan, you know, Republicans, 4 Democrats, and we agree that this is inappropriate for Turkey to be doing this. And so we're hoping that the government, US government is, we know these kind of conversations probably happen behind the scenes. So we hope that the US government is making it clear that this isn't acceptable. But we do know a lot of people in the US government agree with us.
Thank you so much for your remarks and insights. I want to also right now to turn to Evelina, asking her about another question, since she talked about, you know, the warning signs that we had before and the warning signs that there are now. I know she's been also talking about the importance of helping and protecting genocide survivors. Since women are the majority of these victims, are there steps that can be taken to prevent or reduce, you know, the horrific sexual violence that occurred in 2014 from what happening again? Is justice and accountability a part of this? Or is anybody in the whole world, international communities, making any progress in this regard?
Yes, rape and sexual violence are very often used as a weapon of war. And rape and sexual violence have been used across many conflicts as a weapon of war against women and girls. And definitely we need to do more to combat the ever-growing impunity for rape and sexual violence in conflict, but also outside of conflict. This includes strengthening legislation and enhanced investigation and prosecution of sexual violence in conflict and post-conflict situations that is consistent with fair trial guarantees and international law. But addressing the issue of impunity is a crucial step towards fighting also the perception that the use of rape and sexual violence in armed conflicts is a perfect crime for which the perpetrator will not face justice. And even in the case of Daesh atrocities, we've seen this impunity for rape and sexual violence. If we look at some of the recent prosecutions of Daesh perpetrators, and there have been only a few, they've been prosecuted for terror-related offenses only. We have not seen any prosecutions for rape, sexual violence. We also have not seen any prosecutions for genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes. And in the whole world, there was only one prosecution for genocide, and that was in Germany. So of course, impunity is an issue that we need to address because impunity will beget further crime. But what also needs to happen is that we must ensure that rape and sexual violence in war becomes unimaginable. That rape and sexual violence could not be justified by the perpetrators. For this to happen, we do not only need laws and the implementations and enforcements, but we need to change perception of such crimes. And in order to do so, we need to engage leaders and at the national and local level, including community, religious and traditional leaders, to play a more active role in advocating within communities against sexual violence in conflict. We need to engage all levels of the international community and to teach that the use of sexual violence is not acceptable, whether in conflict or in peace times. And religious leaders must play an important role here. And indeed, atrocities such as those perpetrated by Daesh highlight glaring illiteracy that allows the widespread and systematic use of the crime. It has become clear from the interviews with some of the Daesh foreign fighters or their family members that many of them believe that using rape and sexual violence against Yazidi women was justified by the Quran. When asked questions about it, they were not able to identify the relevant passages and rely on statements made by others, serve only to support their interpretation, justifying the use of sexual violence. And this is something that we need to address. And I will just very briefly mention one important initiative here in the UK. In 2019, the UK has been working on a declaration of humanity, which engages international leaders of faith and belief to work towards ending sexual violence in conflict and to tackle the stigma so often faced by survivors. This declaration was meant to be launched at the PSVI conference last year, but of course the conference was cancelled. This declaration is yet to be officially launched, and I hope that once it is launched, many of the attendees here today will support it, will encourage others to support it. To succeed with this very large task of combating rape and sexual violence in conflict, we need everyone to play their role in their different capacities. And when doing so, we need to ensure that the crime becomes unimaginable to be perpetrated, but also unimaginable to be justified.
Thank you so much for your remark. I want to turn to Dr. Emmy. If she thinks that as you said, Evelina, coronavirus will help ISIS in Syria, for example, and other group to regroup, re-emerge, or grow. And also, do you think what Murad proposed could apply to Syria, and how we will make sure, for example, the way that we're thinking about how we will make sure that Yazidi voice is heard in terms when it comes to the security, how can we make sure that happens in Africa, in Syria?
So those are all great, but also very complicated questions. I can just echo what has already been said, that the coronavirus is a huge problem, especially in northeast Syria, where they're essentially under embargo, and it's very difficult to get in the needed medicine, the needed personal protective equipment, etc., for the civilian population. But in large detention facilities like the Al-Hol camp and other detention facilities, that's not the only place where ISIS detainees are held in Syria. Of course, the coronavirus can spread easily in any crowded area. And so this is a real concern. It's a very concern also that, frankly, countries whose citizens voluntarily joined ISIS and traveled to Syria or Iraq, that many of those countries are refusing to take back their own citizens and just sort of absolving themselves of their responsibility for their own citizens. And so that has forced the autonomous administration in northeast Syria to pay for, feeding and housing thousands of ISIS detainees. And of course, that takes away resources they need to take care of the victims of ISIS and to take care of ordinary civilians. So this is a huge injustice. And so I would, call on all of those countries, many of them, European countries, who are just refusing to take back their own citizens, that not only, is that unfair, but they're also increasing the burden on the self-administration and making it more difficult to provide resources to the victims of ISIS and to finding, again, those estimated 3,000 Yazidis who are still missing. I would also say, regarding your second question about the situation in Iraq and Syria, in my report that was just published a few days ago at the Wilson Center, Syrian Yazidis under 4 regimes, where I compared how the Yazidi community was treated by the Assad regime, or ISIS, by the self-administration, and now in areas occupied by Turkey. I included 2 maps in there of Afrin and Ras al-Ain Serikani that documented the violations against Yazidis. And so I hope people will find that useful. But, one thing that I think is important to point out that is often ignored or not perhaps properly recognized is that, ISIS controlled Syria. They had a huge, control of territory in Syria. And there are an estimated 95 Yazidi settlements in Syria. So, there are Yazidi villages all over northern Syria, not only in Afrin and Serikane, but also around Amuda and Qahtaniya and Hasaka. And for the most part, those Yazidi villages were protected from the Islamic State. There were some attacks prior to that by Nusra, but the Islamic State was not able to launch a genocidal assault similar in scale to what they did in Sinjar in Syria. And that is largely because that area in the north where the Yazidi villages are located were for the most part, that area was protected by the YPG and the SDF. And so you did not have the problem of disputed territory because, you know, for the most part, it was controlled, those regions were controlled by the YPG and SDF. And so the disputed nature of the territory between, you know, in Sinjar, where both Erbil and Baghdad are claiming it, and then you have the Shia militias, the Hashd al-Shabi and the different groups, that is a real security threat. And so, you know, clarifying this is absolutely necessary in order to provide the security needed for Yazidis in Sinjar to be able to return home.
Thank you so much, Dr. Remy. I think I'm getting some message that we have 5 more minutes for our panel. So I want to take these 5 more minutes to ask you all, what are your advices if you want to give to international community or to anybody who contribute to the security and safety of Sinjar and Yazidis in general, to promote, you know, the safety and well-being of Yazidi? What is the most important right now in your views, and how could organizations like Free Yazidi Foundation, other organization, Yazidi organization like Yazda and other organization could do to help more?
I may say, I would recommend that the international community, United Nations, BUNAMI, the European Union, the United States, the big stakeholders of in Iraq, you know, to focus this momentum after the 6th anniversary and to initiate formal dialogue in Iraq that will be solely focused on administration and security. Because only through that, I think we can address the issues. We need to sit down, we need to conduct negotiations on these areas and reach into an agreement, security mechanism and administration mechanism for short term and medium term. So short term, we bring things under control. We bring this, create rule of law, and we medium level or long term, we think about you know, sustainability of that security. But it's a dangerous situation, you know, when you have other countries conducting airstrikes and with intention to come and do land intervention, then you're talking about countries fighting countries. You're talking about really huge consequences that will have global consequences. So we need to intervene now at this point. And I see with Kadmi's new government, with the Kurdistan regional government, also a new government in a way. So we can really work, something out. But we have to have formal negotiations that will be supported by global powers and the United Nations and European Union and the US, of course.
Thank you so much. Nadine?
Yes, I believe that, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, we obviously, there's a lot of humanitarian work that needs to be done in Sinjar, and of course we support that. But at the end of the day, there won't be long-term safety unless there's local self-governance and local run security. And of course, Murad's already talked about local police and the need for that. You know, local self-governance and local security everyone seems to the excuse is too big of a lift right now at this point in time. But when will it ever be easy, and when will it ever be the natural thing to do? You know, with the Iranian influence and control and all the corruption, now is the time. There's never a better time. So what I really think the important thing is for the international community, the U.S. government to be resolute in demanding that the Iraq government works with them to remove these armed militias. And this way, Sinjar, you know, economic investment can't happen until that happens, until there's safety. So there's so many things being hacked. So to me, you know, NGOs, you know, I really think a lot of this, the governments need to step up and need to pressure and partner with the Iraqi government to get some of this done, to make this a safe place.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Dr. Amy?
So I would say that I would recommend that the international community, the global coalition, increase their efforts to find the estimated 3,000 Yazidis who are still missing since 2014, and also those Yazidis who've been kidnapped recently since 2018, since the Turkish intervention occupation of Afrin, and then Ras Al Ain Serikani in 2019. you know, Nadine mentioned already how Turkey justifies these interventions, but I would like Turkish officials to explain, how does destroying Yazidi shrines accomplish the defeat of the PKK? How does kidnapping Yazidi civilians accomplish the defeat of the PKK? How does forcing, you know, some 90% of the Yazidi population of Afrin have fled? I mean, these are not measures of counterterrorism. These are measures that more resemble ethnic cleansing. They more resemble a forced demographic change of a region where Yazidis have lived since the 12th century. And so there needs to be pressure on Turkey to, I personally think, withdraw from Afrin and the region that it's occupied in October, in Ras Al Ain and Serengane, because until that happens, Yazidis will not return to their homes. They will not return if they are living in fear of being kidnapped, if their shrines have been destroyed, if they're unable to practice their religion. And so pressure is needed on Turkey to withdraw from Syria and obey the ceasefire agreement that was negotiated by Vice President Pence in October 2019, where Turkey actually committed to protecting the religious and ethnic minorities in the region. And I would personally think, in terms of those Yazidis who are still I would focus efforts in Syria on 3 places. I would focus efforts on Al-Hol, because it is highly likely that there are Yazidis still living in the Al-Hol camp who've been mistakenly detained. Perhaps they're afraid to identify as Yazidis. Second, I would focus on Afrin for all the reasons I've mentioned. And third, I would focus on Idlib, because it is also highly likely that Yazidis are held in Idlib until now by some of the various armed factions in Idlib.
Thank you so much, Dr. Any very important remarks. Evelina, I give you the final comment.
Sure. So of course, other panelists already mentioned a number of really important points in terms of security, and especially Murad's proposal how the issue should be addressed. I think this is something that the international community should take very seriously and consider how to implement it. But also, in addition, what is really needed right now is a monitoring mechanism in place to monitor the situation, identify early warning signs, analyze them, and then work with others, including the proposed security apparatus, to address them as soon as possible and to give prevention a chance. But I also believe that another key factor is to ensure justice for the victims and survivors. Prosecutions of the perpetrators can deter future crime. We need to revive the discussions, for example, on establishing an ad hoc tribunal for Daesh. We need to address the growing feeling of impunity, because impunity begets further crime. So we need to cut the vicious circle of violence, impunity, violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We are ending this session, this panel. I want to thank each one of you for your valuable time, your comment, your valuable insights about security situation for Yazidi. I also want to thank Free Yazidi Foundation for commemorating Yazidi genocide. And I want to thank our Yazidi audience and international audience. Per Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nawaf. All panelists, thank you very much. Nadine, Murad, really appreciate it. Amy, Evelina, and of course, Nawaf did a great job. Thank you all.